All right, everyone, it's time to start off the day talking about one of Joseph Biden's scandals, Joey Biden. It's not the ones that you're hearing about in the news. Mainly, if they get to ask him questions at all, the legacy media asks only about COVID and Afghanistan. So inflation's not a big thing to them. Apparently, prices soaring out of sight, it doesn't matter. Well, they're all rich people, so they don't care probably. The jobs numbers being abysmal, that gets like page B mention, but meanwhile everything else is COVID, Afghanistan, COVID, Afghanistan. But there's one that's, mentioned even less than the jobless numbers, which is the border crisis. The border crisis, which was initially the big problem at the outset of Biden's administration, now doesn't even get talked about. But we got a new report a couple days ago that apparently about a third of all the kids at the border that had been processed in the concentration camps there, the Obama cages that they're stuffed into at 1,600% capacity, yes, up to a third of them have disappeared from the radar. That is, they were put in the country supposedly with relatives or whatever, and now they've disappeared. The DHS has no idea where they are. 5,000 kids. Isn't that goddamn lovely? The problem is that a significant proportion of them are probably in trafficking networks because Biden handed them over to people that weren't really relatives. Or maybe they're a relative, but the fact that they're a relative doesn't mean they don't have cartel connections. Don't you think there's the vague possibility that occasionally happens? DHS didn't do its homework, and now roughly 5,000 migrant children have disappeared into the United States. Great. Now they're fully undocumented. Half of them are probably working in a sweatshop or in a brothel right now. Whoop-de-doo, yay, Joe. I guess some of them probably ended up in the White House in his private sniffy room. Anyway, before we ridicule Biden some more, I know it's low-hanging fruit, but it's still important because it doesn't get done by the legacy media very often, and it's very deserved. Keep in mind down below there will be a pinned comment if you're watching this video on YouTube with links to 4 other video hosting sites that I use. Keep in mind I make 2 exclusive videos every day that are there, and they are not on YouTube or anywhere else. Partially algorithmic, partially because YouTube has a lot of verboten subjects you're not supposed to talk about much, or you're not allowed to give your honest opinion about. Certain medical topics, certain political topics, certain cultural topics. The list grows longer and longer. I half expect them to start banning gaming streams that have too much gratuitous violence in them. Didn't one streamer get banned a couple years ago because in a game where you can, mutilate bodies, he chose to start mutilating a couple of bodies, and even though that's within the game's parameters. I imagine if someone tries to stream Hexen or GTA 3, a new updated texture pack. Whoops, yeah, you killed the hooker after you hired her, and that's basically violence against women, so we're banning your channel. They'd probably do that at this point. Anyway, getting off of the YouTube subject, because it's not the subject of the video, I digress, as usual. Don't you think this should be front page news? I would think, kids and animals, usually they evoke more emotions than other topics. A bunch of dudes die and nobody gives a shit. It's like, well, some dudes died today. And then back to the weather, back to the sports news. There's a baseball game, much more exciting. Dudes hitting a ball. But usually, when 5,000 kids go missing, I would think that's a problem. A third of all of those that had already been processed by DHS in the course of less than a year managed to disappear. Isn't that, wouldn't we call that a pandemic? A pandemic of missing kids. Pandemic is now used very loosely these days to describe anything like that, so I'm just going to coin the missing kids pandemic of Joseph Biden, Beijing Biden. And then we get a separate report that the situation at the border concentration camps with the kid cages is actually deteriorating. We were told months ago by both Psaki and Kamala, Biden didn't want to touch the issue for obvious reasons, when in one of her more cohesive moments where Kamala was actually, speaking to the public instead of hiding at her house or in the White House, or busy with Willie Brown or whatever she's doing these days, that's certainly not doing her job, she assured us, well, yeah, things are over capacity, there's this flood of people, but it's slowing, and we're solving the problem. We're working as fast as we can to process people and make sure that the kids are with their family or friends or whatever, some legal guardian. That's great. You got them with their family and they disappeared. And the border crisis itself has not diminished. The number of crossings is not appreciably lowering. That's number one. Despite the restoration of the Remain in Mexico policy, number two, it's being ignored by the Biden administration, at least it seems. And then you still have all of these border facilities over capacity. It's funny because it was kids in cages under Trump, and now it's just border facilities for unaccompanied minors. Well, basically you're giving them to slavers. Biden gave thousands of kids over to people who may be enslaving them for one purpose or another. It's pretty bad when the idea that little Pablo, instead of being in a brothel, is just in a sweatshop where he works 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Well, at least he's not being pimped out to a bunch of businessmen. I would expect that Biden would actually make such a claim. Well, as far as we know, some of these kids might have ended up in sweatshop networks. Don't worry, though. I'm not going and paying $100 an hour to sniff these kids or anything like that. They're not getting Epstein, who didn't kill himself, by the way. Clinton isn't the one visiting them. It's just a bunch of industrialists wanted to have their sweatshop underneath their factory where the kids can illegally assemble linens or shoes or something. We got to be able to compete with the third world somehow. This is the might of American manufacturing. He'd probably go off on a spiel like that. And this is the way these people think. By the way, they don't want the border crisis to go away. They love this. When people disappear out of the network, they can be exploited more easily, and they're not documented. Bringing new fresh air to the term that I don't think they use anymore, undocumented or illegal immigrant. These people, on paper, they stopped existing. They're not in contact with DHS. Okay, you gave this kid over to someone who's supposedly their uncle or their godfather or whatever, and then they disappear. What do you think happened? Do you think it's more likely that the uncle or the godfather just, whoops, I forgot to file off my letter this month saying, yeah, here's a picture of Pablo, he's doing okay? Or do you think that he's being raped in the basement? But Biden, of course, sees this as humanitarian. The Democrats have been actively clamoring for this situation to occur. Supposedly, keeping people out of the country, that's inhumane, inhospitable, brutal, it's evil, it's the opposite of what our civilization's meant to be. We need to save these kids. So then you bring them into the country, you keep them for months and months in crowded facilities where they're getting like all sorts of diseases, by the way, as well. They're suffering, in some cases, abuse at the hands of DHS officials. Then they finally get released and they end up slaves. Oh, yeah, well, the humanitarian side of the U.S. Border policy under Beijing Biden. This was begged for by a significant proportion of the population. I love it when people think that they're pushing for something that is progressive and nice and kind, and it turns out that it's exactly the opposite. It would be kinder to go in and overthrow some of these dysfunctional commie regimes in Central America and install capitalistic countries that'll at least stabilize the economy so you'll have less refugee movements. And by the way, with the Remain in Mexico policy, why are we still processing migrant kids from Central America when they're supposed to stay in Mexico? What, because they're already in the United States? There's no safe third country? It's not retroactively applied despite the fact that the policy was in place when many of them were physically in Mexico. So essentially, for the first few months, everyone just rushes across the border and they all get clemency as well. That's not the way the policy is supposed to work. So you mean that any administration pending a SCOTUS case can simply admit a massive wave of migrants into the United States, totally ignoring our previous agreement? Well, that's going to be great for every subsequent Dem administration in history. They'll use them as slaves and as pawns for political games. Wonderful. To all the Biden voters out there, some of which are, not 6 feet under or cremated at this point, you realize you're partially responsible for thousands of child sex slaves now being in the United States, right? You realize that, correct? That's not humanitarian, not by any stretch of the imagination. That's about all. Peace out.